Hey guys, tonight we slip barefoot across burning sands, the sun melting behind black pyramids as gold glints on a woman's ankle. Not just any woman. This is a Nubian queen, wrapped in linen so fine it clings like mist, her lips painted with crushed carnelian, her gaze sharper than a lioness in heat. She doesn't marry for love. She marries for power, for gold, for survival. She marries the way others launch wars, with a wink and a dagger behind her back. Her wedding bed is a throne. And you're about to crawl right into it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dust of ancient Nubia, where the Nile curls like a silver snake between jagged cliffs and secret kingdoms. The air is thick with heat and incense, and somewhere nearby, drums echo faintly, wedding drums, though not the kind you're used to. In this land, a wedding isn't a celebration. It's a contract, a calculated ritual, a stage for seduction and strategy. The bride isn't smiling, she's studying, calculating which cousin to poison, which lover to keep hidden behind silk curtains. Historians still argue whether Nubia's queens ruled through charm or sheer brutality. The truth? Likely both. You crouch by a temple column etched with hieroglyphs that don't just honor gods, they gossip. One tells of Amanitore, queen of Kush, who took lovers like sips of wine and married men like moves on a gameboard. In one famous tale pulled from the erotic archives of the region, a young noblewoman named Tarekeniwal staged her wedding to a much older gold-rich warlord, not out of duty, but desire. She reportedly arrived in a boat covered in lotus blossoms, wearing only translucent linen and a golden collar shaped like lion fangs. That night, she didn't just share his bed, she seized his treasury. When he died mysteriously 2 moons later, people whispered of poisoned kisses and dreams too good to be true. In Nubia, sexuality wasn't whispered behind fans. It was a language spoken in oil-slicked skin, in the swing of hips draped with chain belts, in the way a bride's veil barely concealed anything at all. One fringe tidbit: they believed crocodile dung made excellent contraceptive paste. That's right, nothing says romance like slipping a bit of Nile poop into your pre-wedding routine. But the more curious detail is how women here weren't just passive prizes. They were players, plotters, power brokers. And when it came to marriage, they made sure the scales tilted in their favor, even if it meant marrying their own brothers. You pause in the shade of a palace gate where a half-statue, half-tomb stands. Tall, weathered, but still imposing. It belongs to Tarekeniwal, a queen who ruled solo while claiming her husband was also her brother. It belongs to Tarekeniwal, a queen who ruled solo while claiming her husband was also her brother. Claimed her husband was also her brother. A common practice that kept royal bloodlines undiluted and alliances painfully permanent. She signed decrees, led armies, and made lovers of men who bowed before her, even if their titles were technically king. You follow the path down into a shaded garden. Figs burst on the branch, bees hover lazily over blue lotus, and somewhere, you imagine the rustle of fabric, a laugh behind a carved screen. Maybe it's just wind, or maybe it's the ghost of another queen, one who seduced her way past foreign generals and sent Egyptian priests reeling. Historians still argue whether women like Amanitore used magic, or merely the illusion of it, wearing panther skin robes during negotiations, anointing herself in perfumed oils until she shimmered like the river at dusk. One visiting roman chronicled a black empress with the eyes of a jackal and the hips of a dancer, who offered him wine and riddles and left him broke and barefoot the next morning. Was she real? Maybe, or maybe she's every Nubian bride, distilled into myth, fierce, untouchable, devastatingly clever. So tonight, as you lie there in the dark, remember love in ancient Nubia wasn't candlelight and vows. It was strategy disguised as flirtation, alliance sealed with scented skin. Gold wasn't worn for beauty, it was bait. Marriage wasn't about forever, it was about next week's power play. And you're just getting started. The sand softens under your feet as you drift deeper into the royal district, where the walls breathe heat and the air tastes faintly of saffron and bloodline. You pass through a narrow corridor lined with painted reliefs, men kneeling, women towering over them, draped in silks that whisper stories of inheritance and strategy. Here, in the inner sanctum of the Nubian elite, marriage isn't a union of hearts. It's the blueprint of empire. And if it means marrying your own half-brother, so be it. You step into the shadow of a dynasty built on incest, not as a scandal, but a safeguard. The logic is brutal. If you marry your sister, your wealth stays in the family. Your throne doesn't fracture. Your blood remains divine, or at least divinely complicated. Historians still argue whether these marriages were born of necessity or narcissism, but the records are clear. Royal women, often daughters of queens, who ruled in their own right, married their brothers, their uncles, sometimes their own sons, all to keep the lineage locked tight like a golden anklet with no clasp. In one famous example, Queen Amanitore great niece married her own uncle to prevent a rival clan from claiming the southern mines. Their wedding was less a celebration and more a chess move with silk banners. The bride wore a leopard cloak, the groom a collar of lapis lazuli. The priest's chant was drowned out by the clinking of gold bars, being counted just offstage. You walk past a basin filled with scented water and glance down, half expecting to see the reflection of one of these queens, adjusting her headdress, or studying her painted mouth before meeting her new husband, also her cousin, also her bodyguard, also the third claimant to a trade route. One tale, scribbled in faint red ink on a preserved scroll fragment, speaks of Princess Comet, a woman so politically vital that she was married 3 times by age 17, each time to a closer relative. The final husband, a half-brother, was said to be soft of voice and fond of wine. They had a wedding ceremony that lasted 5 days, during which Comet was carried on a throne of ebony and ivory, while her groom followed behind on foot, drunk and weeping. She was crowned before the consummation. He was sent to govern a desert outpost soon after, never to return. Behind these unions was a strange mix of erotic control and administrative genius. You could almost hear the Queen Mother whispering advice. Behind a veil, he may be your brother, but he's also a fool. So smile at the altar and sign the grain treaty before dinner. The sensuality of these marriages wasn't erased by the familial ties. In fact, the eroticism was often heightened by ritual. The Kama Sutra, though not Nubian in origin, describes ceremonial unions where the bride's body is anointed with oils and painted with sacred patterns. Some Nubian records describe similar customs, where gold dust was blown onto the bride's chest and the groom's hands were bound in silk until he whispered her full title 3 times. A fringe tidbit? Some Nubian queens were buried with miniature figurines of their husbands, some in embrace, others bent in subservient poses. Archaeologists still debate whether these were tokens of affection, reminders of dominance, or elaborate, passive-aggressive notes to the gods. You pass a low wall scrawled with graffiti, not modern, but ancient, depicting a scene where a woman stands atop a man's back, holding a scepter in one hand and what appears to be a wine jug in the other. It's captioned in rough script, "She reigns, he drinks." Whether satire or tribute, the sentiment feels consistent. These women weren't prizes, they were tacticians. If marriage required velvet gloves on iron fists, they wore them gladly. And yet, not all these unions were cold. A single preserved love poem, scratched into ivory, describes a queen thanking her brother husband for bringing her honey cakes and defending her right to speak before the council. She ends with a promise to anoint his feet in rose oil, if he behaves. You can't help but smirk. Romance, even in dynastic prisons, finds its odd little pockets. As the night thickens, you trace your fingers along the cool stone, wondering just how much power one can hold when she chooses her groom. Like a general picks soldiers, not for affection, but for function. The perfume of burnt myrrh curls through a stone hallway as you pass into the temple quarters, where columns rise like petrified trees and soft chanting hums behind heavy linen drapes. You're not here to pray. You're here to witness how the sacred became sensual, how priestesses in ancient Nubia didn't just serve the gods. They seduced power itself. You pause by a shallow bowl filled with petals floating on oil, placed beneath a carved relief of a woman lying on her side, both alluring and divine. This is the realm of temple women, cloaked in ritual and mystery, whose roles straddled the border between holy and haunting. Historians still argue whether these priestesses were genuine spiritual leaders or highly trained courtesans cloaked in incense and moral ambiguity. But either way, they wielded more influence than most men dared admit. Their rituals weren't bloodless. They involved bodies' bare skin slicked with scented resin, words whispered against collarbones, breath offered up like sacrifice. In one preserved account, a high priestess named Nefertari was known to cure the ill and soothe the angry through what texts euphemistically call sacred embraces. One general, cursed with battlefield night terrors, reportedly emerged from her chambers sleepless but smiling, cured by what she called divine rebalancing. You step through a veil of beads into a candlelit chamber where the walls flicker with shadowy murals. A woman lies surrounded by acolytes, her face serene as they prepare her for the night's communion, a ritual said to invite the god Amun into her body. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just spiritual ecstasy. It was politics and perfume. Each ritual bolstered the woman's claim to power, her aura enhanced by divine proximity. The public might whisper about what actually happened behind closed veils, but none would dare challenge her afterward. One erotic story buried in the margins of an old scroll and quoted centuries later in the erotic spirit through history tells of a young novice named Kare, chosen for her beauty and grace, trained for years in spiritual arts and sensual control. On the night of her first communion, she anointed her own body with lotus balm and greeted a noble merchant in private, under the pretense of honoring Hathor. By dawn, she had received both a land deed and a secret pact of protection. That's not prayer, that's negotiation. Fringe detail: some priestesses kept pet monkeys, trained to perform dances or mimic gestures of guests. A monkey once interrupted a royal ceremony by stealing a ring from a pharaoh's guest, revealing a hidden love token that nearly triggered a diplomatic scandal. Divine chaos, one might say. But not all these women wielded power through softness. Some combined erotic mystique with economic force. A rare stele depicts Queen Priestess Amanitore seated on a lion throne, flanked not by priests, but by tax collectors. Her marriage to the high priest of Thebes, likely arranged through temple rites, was less about romance and more about monopolizing trade routes. She used temple rituals as propaganda, performing blessings that just so happened to coincide with new tariffs. You lean against a cool column and imagine her voice slow, measured, layered with honey and venom, telling a visiting envoy, the gods favor obedience, especially from men who wish to keep their ships. And yet, beneath the heavy layers of ritual, there was still sensuality, intention, even pleasure. One scroll details a practice where the priestess and her chosen consort would spend a full moon cycle in seclusion, meditating and slowly reducing speech to just breath and touch, believing that silence would unlock divine visions. Whether it did is still up for debate, but the report ends with a note that the consort emerged trembling and weeping, declaring his soul had been touched. You're not sure if that was from the gods or just very persuasive fingers. The blending of the sacred and the sexual isn't unique to Nubia, but here it was systematized, glorified, and used as scaffolding for power. These women weren't simply vessels. They were architects. They built empires from whispers and dances, from the heat of their bodies and the chill of their precision. You leave the temple, blinking into the moonlight, and realize that in Nubia, even salvation had a scent, and it usually came wrapped in gold and silk. A hand slides the lid off a carved wooden chest, and you swear the scent of clove and old secrets drifts up like a ghost. Inside, silk veils dyed in royal purple, anklets that still rattle faintly when disturbed, and a blade so delicate it looks ceremonial until you spot the blood groove. Welcome to the wedding preparations of a Nubian bride. Here, a dowry isn't just beads and grain, it's ammunition. It's leverage, and sometimes it's lethal. You step into the private quarters of a noble household where women huddle around. The future bride, adjusting her collar, slipping rings onto every joint of her fingers, whispering strategies more than blessings. Her eyes flick to a mirror made not of glass, but polished bronze, and you notice her reflection isn't smiling. She's rehearsing, not for her vows, but for her next move. Because this marriage is a battlefield disguised as a banquet. Historians still argue whether Nubian dowries functioned more like peace offerings or war chests, but there's no debate about their weight, literal and symbolic. One tale, passed down in fragmented oral histories, recounts the wedding of Lady Nakarura, a wealthy merchant's daughter known for her beauty and an eerie silence. Her dowry included bolts of rare linen, 5 camels, and a single falcon trained to attack on command. Her groom, a provincial warlord with a wandering eye, laughed at the bird. 3 weeks later, it gouged out his mistress's face during a feast. Nakarura didn't flinch, just offered the bird a strip of roast duck. You trail behind a young bride-to-be as she crosses a courtyard filled with statues, some whole, some toppled. She carries a chest with both hands, and when she opens it before her husband's family, you see an ivory comb, 2 jars of perfumed oil, and an obsidian knife wrapped in silk. No one speaks, because everyone knows what the knife means: insurance. If this union turns sour, she won't beg. She bleed her way out. Some fringe historians speculate that high-born women were trained in basic assassination, how to press a blade between ribs without staining their silk, a theory supported by certain royal tombs where brides were buried with daggers next to love poems. You pass a mural showing a bride with a cobra curled around her wrist, a symbol of both fertility and warning. Above her, an inscription: she brings life or death, as she chooses. The visual alone tells you everything. Marriage here wasn't a fairy tale, it was a transaction, but not cold, just sharp, calculated. And when executed well, it could elevate a woman beyond her station. One erotic anecdote, drawn from a compilation in Sex with Kings, tells of a young woman named Halida, who seduced her way into a political marriage by pretending to faint at a royal banquet. The prince rushed to her side. She murmured about the heat and how strong his arms felt. By morning, her marriage was arranged. By evening, she had already begun advising him on grain taxes. She later orchestrated a temple alliance that secured her family's trade monopoly. Her dowry? A scroll with coded trade routes, a rare fertility amulet, and a dancer who doubled as a spy. You can't help but admire the layering of roles: wife, seductress, strategist, patron. In a world where a single misplaced word could doom a generation, these women weaponized charm and curated their dowries like military supply kits. A lesser-known but curious tradition involved the night boxa, a small container gifted to the bride containing nighttime tools, sleep oil, a lockpick, and sometimes a silk mask. Scholars debate whether this was meant for pleasure, protection, or escape, possibly all three. You walk past a painted screen. hearing echoes of clinking bracelets and hushed laughter. Behind it, a bride sits with her cousin, testing him with riddles meant to gauge his cunning. He gets two wrong. She raises an eyebrow, leans forward, and tells him, "You're pretty, but I may need smarter." It's a joke, mostly. But he laughs too loudly. She notices. The wedding will still happen. Of course, it's already politically set. But you know to keep her real plans locked behind that same carved chest you saw earlier. As the music swells in the distance and the final garments are layered. Onto her shoulders the bride stands tall, a queen in waiting, a dagger in velvet. And you realize, in Nubia, marriage wasn't just about love or gold. It was a test of who could smile with poison in their pocket and still kiss like a promise. The Nile glows silver in the moonlight, wide as a secret and twice as dangerous. A royal barge glides silently across its surface, lanterns flickering. Along the edges like fireflies possessed. A woman lounges beneath a canopy, draped in midnight blue linen, one hand idly tracing the lip of a golden goblet. She isn't Nubian royalty waiting for her groom, she's bait. And the man rowing desperately toward her, cutting across borders and propriety, is a foreign king who thinks he's the one in control. Spoiler alert, he's not. You settle onto the shore as the soft crunch of diplomatic sandals approaches. The pharaoh comes bearing pearls, incense, and the subtle arrogance of empire. But the Nubian emissary, this woman reclining like temptation, itself smiles with a practiced tilt of her head. And before the man has uttered the first word of negotiation, he's already lost the game. Historians still argue whether Nubian women intentionally weaponized their sensuality during international treaties, or if the men simply underestimated them and walked willingly into golden traps. Either way, you're about to watch diplomacy go horizontal. One famous encounter is preserved in both Egyptian and Kushite accounts. Queen Amanitore's, the one-eyed warrior queen, reportedly met with a Roman envoy sent to demand tribute. Instead of compliance, she offered him dinner herself, draped in crimson cloth, her skin perfumed with frankincense, her words like silk-wrapped knives. She never signed the treaty. He did. A month later, she invaded his territory and returned with stolen statues of Augustus. She kept one in her garden as a pet project. Power moves, Nubian style. You trail the story deeper into the sandstone halls of a desert palace turned embassy, where another tale whispers from the past of a woman named Senket, cousin to a Nubian prince sent to seduce an aging Egyptian governor as part of a secret accord. She brought with her a troupe of dancers, 3 carts of rare spices, and a mirror with a hidden compartment for coded messages. The governor fell in love. She fell asleep halfway through the 3rd evening. But not before he rewrote his will, assigning her control of 3 ports and half his grain stores. Senket returned home unmarried, but very, very wealthy. A fringe account claims she later became a patron of astronomy and funded the first map of the southern stars, using gold her husband never noticed was missing. You walk past a broken column, its inscription worn but still legible. Her kiss, his surrender. No names, no context. Just truth. And that truth echoes in dozens of similar stories, where Nubian women turn seduction into strategy, folding intimacy into international politics like it was another clause in the treaty. Even the Kama Sutra, written far from Nubia, outlines techniques of subtle influence, glances, silences, the power of withdrawal, and you realize how universal this dance has always been. In one translated passage, a queen advises her ladies to let him chase your gaze, not your footsteps, a sentiment you imagine scrawled in some lost Nubian script beside a throne room bench. But don't be fooled into thinking this was all calculated coldness. These women knew pleasure too. Real, intentional, often mutual. A preserved love letter between a Nubian noblewoman and a visiting Persian merchant reveals a layered connection politics. Yes, but also longing. She writes, Of his voice, of the way his laughter softened her guard. She also reminds him to send more lapis lazuli and to keep quiet about the trade route they mapped together under the stars. Romance and revenue perfectly intertwined. You turn a corner and come face to face with a faded mural. Two figures, locked in an embrace, one with the sun disk of Amen above her brow, the other wearing the short kilt of a foreign dignitary. Below them, the Nile curls into a symbol of union, not just between people, but between kingdoms. And yet, you can't help but feel the weight of control tilting toward the woman's painted eyes. She's not smiling, she's deciding. Foreign. Kings came expecting conquests and left with tattoos of her name. Traders arrived with maps and left with oaths. These weren't just love stories. They were treaties written on skin, agreements sealed with silk and breath. And as you lie back, listening to the imagined lap of water against a royal barge, you realize that sometimes the most devastating warriors wore no armor at all, just perfume, patience, and a gaze sharp enough to redraw borders. The wedding tent shimmers like a mirage, its silk panels fluttering in the desert breeze, barely muting the laughter, the moans, and the murmured threats beneath. Inside, you find the usual suspects: diplomats sipping honeyed wine, dancers spinning with swords balanced on their heads, and at the center, a bride perched on a gilded cushion like a crowned spider. Her groom is somewhere behind her already, sweating through his formal robe. She's not looking for him. She's watching his brother. This is the part of Nubian royal life where the silk veil's thin and the scandal's thick. Where marriage isn't just a partnership, it's a performance. And often, a trap. You sidle past a column painted with palm leaves and spot a servant whispering into another's ear. Something about last night's surprise guest in the bride's quarters. Something about an heir who looks suspiciously like the general, not the prince. Historians still argue whether the Nubian courts condoned polyamorous unions or simply ignored them out of necessity, but the records leave behind a spicy trail of side-eyes and suspicious births. You hear one name repeated in several scroll. Fragments: Queen Saharaket, whose wedding to the chief of border affairs was lauded as a political masterpiece. But it was the commander of the Southern Cavalry who fathered her first son, a detail she never denied. When asked by a Roman chronicler how she explained the boy's unmatched archery skills, she replied with a shrug, "It runs in the blood." His real father's blood. The official husband said nothing, likely because he was too busy seducing Saharaket's cousin. You don't walk through these halls. You tiptoe, because the scent of scandal is thick as rose oil here, and every carved screen hides more than shadow. A fringe story, half preserved on a faded ostrakhan, tells of a marriage contract torn and rewritten mid-ceremony. The bride, a lesser princess named Maneto, reportedly changed her mind as her groom stumbled drunk into the altar. Instead of canceling, she calmly called for his younger brother, declared him more visually promising, and had the priests bless the new match before anyone finished the second verse of the marriage chant. The original groom, given a consolation estate and a warning not to return until the next flood season. You can't help but admire the sheer audacity, not cruelty, clarity. In Nubia, a woman knew what she wanted, and more importantly, what she didn't. And if you think jealousy didn't simmer behind the golden walls, think again. There's an erotic anecdote in the history of sexuality about a noblewoman named Katira who took 3 lovers before marrying any of them. Instead of choosing one, she held a private competition: 3 nights, 3 themes, 1 performance. Each, the winner got the ring. The losers received gifts and were reassigned to her personal guard. Katira later ruled 2 provinces and wrote poetry about the pleasures of controlled chaos. You picture her now lounging in her garden, sipping date wine, composing verses while her ex-lovers polished their spears under her window. Not a bad life, really. Some of the most controversial fragments hint that even arranged marriages included. Exit clauses, cleverly negotiated by the brides themselves. One tablet refers to a 3-moon rule. If the bride had not conceived or been satisfied within 3 lunar cycles, she could return to her family with her dowry untouched and her reputation somehow glowing brighter. That's not a loophole. That's a flex. You pass a statue with the eyes scratched out, a warning, or maybe revenge. Beneath it, an inscription. She remembered. He forgot. No further context. Just that. The air here is thick with jasmine and tension. You hear a flute, soft and sharp. Somewhere behind the latticework, another deal is being made. Another body being offered, not as sacrifice, but as strategy. Love in these stories rarely wears white. It wears red and gold and always carries conditions. You imagine one final scene. A bride slipping from her tent at dawn, sandals in hand, dress loosened, a grin on her face. She glances back only once to a groom who's still asleep, unaware that he's just sealed a trade route with his vows and lost his favorite. Port to her cousin in the same breath. In Nubia, betrayal wasn't a sin. It was survival with better jewelry. You wake to the smell of blue lotus and storm, an impossible scent in the dry heart of Nubia, and for a second, you think it's a dream. Then you hear the drums, low, slow, not for war. For worship. But not the kind with bowed heads and clasped hands. This is temple worship of a different breed, where the gods are lovers, and the women who claim them walk barefoot into myth. You follow the beat through winding stone alleys until you reach a raised platform strewn with petals and slick with oil. A woman stands at its center, head tilted, arms wide, gold chains brushing her bare shoulders. Her eyes are closed. She is not praying, she is summoning, or seducing, or both. And the crowd below watches not with reverence, but with anticipation. Because tonight, a god might descend. Or more likely, she pretend he has, and in doing so, sees power no mortal man could give. Historians still argue whether these divine trysts were symbolic or physical, if they were mere theater or actual belief. But the outcomes remain: sons born of gods, women elevated to semi-divinity, alliances forged not by sword, but by skin. In one particularly famous legend, Queen Amanitore claimed her youngest son was conceived during a ritual with the sun god Rhea. No mortal touched her. She insisted only golden light and sacred breath. Convenient? Absolutely. But her child grew up to rule unchallenged. His blood considered untouchable. His crown carved with solar rays instead of royal lineage. Coincidence or cosmic seduction? No one dared ask. You trace your fingers along a mural showing a queen seated with a god's hand resting on her thigh. Beneath it, the caption reads, "From his flame, she rose." That's not metaphor. That's policy. And the bedroom became a battlefield of celestial claims. One story, pulled from the margins of the scroll and later retold in Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, speaks of a young acolyte named Telemet who faked nightly visions of Thoth whispering into her dreams. With each vision, she gained more influence, eventually becoming the chief oracle and sleeping in a gilded bed, said to pulse with divine energy. Her rivals accused her of fraud. Her reply? She challenged them to sleep in the temple and survive the night without weeping. None did. You can't decide whether she was mad, brilliant, or both. Fringe rumors suggest that some of these women used smoke, fermented oils, and mild hallucinogens to enhance the presence of gods. A favorite trick involved placing mirrors near torches to create flickering halos, making an ordinary man seem like a deity mid-embrace. By morning, what happened was called sacred. Conveniently sacred. There's one erotic tale about a queen named Zala who chose her lovers from among the temple guards and claimed each one was possessed by a different god. She even kept an official record, listing the nights, the names, and the divine qualities each encounter revealed. When challenged, she simply held up the scroll and said, "Speak against me," and speak against your gods. She kept her throne for 3 decades. Even the Kama Sutra discusses the divine as erotic muse, describing how gods inspire both sensuality and strategy. You imagine the intersection here, where a soft gasp becomes scripture, and a well-timed sigh rewrites a kingdom's fate. You reach a chamber lit only by moonlight, where painted ceilings depict star gods entwined with priestesses, and you realize something fundamental. These women weren't waiting to be chosen. They chose, they embodied, they declared. And the world adjusted to fit their declarations. The power wasn't in the actual act, it was in the performance, the narrative, the audacity to say, I am divine, because I said so. One tablet fragment records a high priestess declaring to a foreign scribe, when I lie with the gods, your laws bend around my hips. He translated it poorly, noting only, she speaks in riddles, but you understand. Because in this world, seduction wasn't a sin, it was sacrament. And every touch, every moan, every breath was part of a higher strategy to birth power, claim divinity, and remind everyone watching that heaven, sometimes, wore a Nubian crown and nothing else. The palace feels quieter now. Not silent, never silent, but subdued, like a drum still echoing after the dance is done. You walk through the Hall of Inscriptions, where names are etched into stone not just to be remembered, but to be obeyed. And here's what strikes you most. They're almost all female. Not as afterthoughts. As authors, queens, brides, rulers, wives who ruled long after their husbands faded into the limestone. You trail your fingers across one name etched deeply, as if carved by someone who knew she would not be forgotten, and feel the weight of legacy pressed into the wall. In ancient Nubia, a woman didn't just marry for gold or power. She wrote her own legend in ink and blood and soft-footed decisions. And when the linens were finally folded and the daggers sheathed, what remained was law, custom, culture shaped by lipstick and strategy. Historians still argue whether these women truly changed inheritance practices, or if their influence was quietly erased over time. But inscriptions say otherwise. Legal records show dowry laws that favored female lines, adoption clauses that prioritized maternal blood, even property rights passed down through daughters. That's not accident, that's design. And it wasn't just written in scrolls, it was scratched into tomb walls, painted into palace murals, whispered down through generations. One story, recovered in pieces from 2 different temple ruins, tells of Queen Basharet, who lost her husband to a failed siege and was expected to step down. Instead, she invoked an obscure law probably written by a woman centuries earlier that allowed her to remain regent if she could prove lineage. Through her mother, she presented a sealed amulet, a childhood bracelet, and a blood-red veil said to have been her mother's wedding shroud. The council didn't just approve her rule, they renamed the law after her. You walk into a courtyard and see a statue missing one arm, its remaining hand raised in defiance. Beneath it, a phrase still visible, she chose. We followed. Not everyone was pleased. A fringed tablet buried under a collapsed granary speaks bitterly of the time of women, warning of daughters who speak like generals and wives who summon kings. It was meant as criticism, but you smile. Because isn't that the point? These weren't passive figures lost to time. They were architects of systems still debated, still felt. One erotic anecdote, softer than the others but no less sharp, speaks of an elder queen unnamed who took a younger lover not out of political necessity, but for joy. He was a craftsman, she was retired, in a sense. But she visited his studio every week, sometimes alone, sometimes escorted. The guards joked, until the queen issued an edict declaring artisans essential to the state and made his trade tax-exempt. That was her final royal act. The man later carved a figurine of her, nude but crowned, which now sits in a museum mislabeled Unknown Goddess. Of course, even in legacy, They blur the line between mortal and myth. And that's what lingers as you reach the final chamber. The subtle, persistent shape of their power. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was written in the arrangements of marriages, the clauses in contracts, the timing of births, the pauses in negotiations, the curve of an eyebrow across a wine cup. You sit beside a small pool, reflecting starlight, and imagine her, any one of them, walking through the garden in the cool of night, rings clicking softly, crown tilted not from weight, but from choice. She ruled. She seduced. She protected. And when her time passed, she left a legacy not in temples, but in law. In the way her daughters raised their sons. In the way her name was still spoken, with both awe and warning. So as your breathing slows and your eyes begin to slip shut, remember, power doesn't always wear a sword. Sometimes it wears a veil. Sometimes it kisses instead of kills. But it always leaves a mark. Even now, centuries later, you can still trace it in ink, in gold dust, in the cool stone beneath your fingers. End of script. Sweet dreams.